In the aftermath of a failed partnership with Sony, developer Factor 5 Inc. entered an experimental phase in late 2007. This involved pitching a variety of games to publishers, like their attempt at doing Kid Icarus with Nintendo. What emerged from these months of negotiations was what would later turn out to be their last major title in development. This was their spin on the classic DC comic superhero character, Superman. A project with lofty ambitions, this was one team's sincere attempt to do the property justice and succeed where others had failed before them. Established in March 2007, Brash Entertainment was a publisher that attempted to build a business exclusively out of licensed video games. With a base of operations on Sunset Boulevard, they built themselves as Hollywood's first ever video game publisher. It enjoyed a promising start, raising $400 million with large investments from a number of private equity firms. Receiving a lot of publicity in its first months, many expected Brash to become one of the next big names in video game publishing. Later into 2007, they struck a deal with Warner Bros. To publish a number of games based around DC comic superhero characters, including The Flash and Superman. Factor 5's involvement with Brash's Superman project came about due to their years of experience with flight games, primarily from the Star Wars Rogue Squadron series. When development wrapped up on Lair, their PS3 exclusive for Sony, they began to pitch for Superman in late 2007. Their artists put together a gallery of concept art pieces depicting the caped hero and a number of his adversaries from the comics. These ranged from the familiar like General Zod to more obscure choices such as Brimstone. The team explored the IP extensively, contemplating the gallery of rogues that would feature in this theoretical Superman title. Brash, however, didn't just want them to produce a completely standalone game. It was meant to, in some way, tie into an upcoming Superman movie which was being worked on in the very early planning phases at Warner Bros. This was a sequel to Bryan Singer's 2006 film, Superman Returns. Singer planned to direct the follow-up, which is said to have involved a fairly world-destroying plot, with big-screen live-action debuts from major villains like Darkseid and Brainiac planned. It would have released in 2009 under the title Man of Steel, not to be confused with the unrelated Zack Snyder movie from 2013. Initially, Warner Bros. Had expected the film to enter production not too long after the release of Returns, when Singer made the decision to take a short break from superhero movies to do historical thriller Valkyrie for 20th Century Fox. This pushed the schedule back a year, but it was still expected to begin when Singer was ready. In March 2008, the collaboration deal between Brash and Factor 5 was announced. According to the initial press release, the title they were working on together would be disclosed in July around E3. This never happened because the game by that time was still only in early pre-production and was not ready to be shown. For the first months of 2008, Factor 5 had mapped out their plans to take on the Man of Steel. Although the game would have featured the characters set to appear in Bryan Singer's sequel movie, Darkseid and Brainiac, its roster of villains extended well beyond that. It drew upon the different corners of the expanded DC universe, including Firestorm villainess Killer Frost, for example. Essentially, any character that the team thought would make for an interesting showdown was put under consideration. At first, the project was referred to internally under the codename of Blue Steel. This was an amalgamation of a few different cultural references. One was obviously hinting at Superman's popular nickname, the Man of Steel, as well as one of the main colours featured in his costume. But this was also a nod to Blue Harvest, the working title of Star Wars Return of the Jedi, which George Lucas used to mask the film's production from the media. Early on into pre-production, it was decided that Blue Steel would be an open-world game taking place in and around Metropolis. It was set to be a fairly vast and detailed landscape, with plenty for Superman to see and do around the city. The lead development platform was the PS3, since the company had experience with the console from their time on Lair, and already had the necessary development kits at their disposal. An Xbox 360 port of the PlayStation 3 game was planned too though, as was a version of the game for the Nintendo Wii. Factor 5's management were big fans of the Wii, and wanted to work with Nintendo's console at every given opportunity. Although Brash had actually only ordered it for the Xbox 360 and PS3, they were insistent that a Wii version be made as well. The publisher wasn't paying them extra to develop the Wii game alongside its HD cousin. it was being made out of their enthusiasm for the hardware. If there was one aspect above all that the team was determined about getting right, it was the control system. To them, the project would essentially live or die upon whether or not they could construct a control interface that players would respond well to. From their point of view, the game not only needed to capture the raw power of Superman's abilities, it needed to feel natural. They understood the difficulties of this, how hard it would be to combine the various aspects of his repertoire like his heat vision with precise and reliable flight controls. It was a challenge that they enthusiastically accepted. To demonstrate their ideas, a target video was produced for internal use in around summer 2008. The video portrayed a showdown between Superman and Doomsday, a preview of just one of many fights planned for the game. It showed the level of graphical fidelity they were aiming for and some of their planned controls. One of the central new mechanics the team had outlined is shown off during it, the ability to grapple with enemies and charge them through solid structures to weaken them. It was hoped that players would be able to do this to just about any building in the open world, as the destruction is dynamically rendered in real time. Even for Factor 5, a company that was revered for its technological ability, this mechanic had high ambitions of pushing the hardware to its limits. Midway into the year, the project suddenly found itself jeopardized by external circumstances beyond the control of the developers. Having finished his movie Valkyrie, Bryan Singer was now hoping to continue work on his Superman Returns sequel. It was at this point that Warner Bros. Told him that over the course of his time away, they had changed their minds. They no longer wanted to move forward with his Man of Steel movie and had lost interest in producing a Superman film within the near future. WB had decided to put the film series on ice and planned to reboot it several years down the line, which they later did with the 2013 movie, coincidentally also named Man of Steel. While the demise of Singer's project did not mean that Blue Steel would in turn be cancelled, it still was potentially bad news for the game. It meant that since the video game would no longer tie into it, Warner Bros. Was now not as politically motivated to see it to completion. If it ever ran into problems with, for example, funding, the odds of WB helping the developers out were now significantly less. Once the Singer movie was out of the equation, Brash and Factor 5 kept the project going as a completely standalone Superman game. It took on a slightly different identity, as more of a celebration of the character's history. There was no grand scheme for a story worked out at any point. Nobody on the team considered themselves much of a writer, but what they did want to do was build a plot that would pay homage to some of Superman's most iconic battles. The scope of their source material wasn't limited to the comic books, they were also calling upon classic scenes from the film series. One sequence in particular they were hoping to recapture was Superman's famous fight against General Zod and his fellow Kryptonian warriors from Superman 2. The team developed a variety of rough gameplay concepts and animations to embody some of their ideas, such as one early test scene in which Superman has to use his heat vision to prevent a damaged bridge from collapsing. This period of experimenting with different characters and making concept scenarios went on for months, lasting to the end of development. Again, there was no concrete idea for a plot. The purpose of this was to compile a list of all the essential Superman components, boiling the property down to its most interesting heroes, villains, and set pieces that could feasibly work within the context of a video game. Alongside Darkseid and Brainiac, there were plans to add Bizarro, Darkseid's son Kalibak, and of course, the Man of Steel's time-honored human nemesis, Lex Luthor. Another concept they'd come up with revolved around the malevolent cyborg Metallo. Superman would have first fought him in his standard exoskeleton form. Once Metallo is critically damaged, he would have absorbed the buildings around him to transform himself into a giant metallic monstrosity in a desperate last bid to turn the tide of battle. In addition to this host of baddies, Factor 5 was hoping to include appearances from other key heroes, namely Supergirl. This and other flying characters would have been made fully playable in a multiplayer mode they had outlined. What exactly this would have entailed is not known, however, as it was never worked on to any great extent. This is true of a lot of Blue Steel, as the project was largely unable to advance beyond the drawing board. In November 2008, news of a disaster was in the air. The game's publisher, Brash Entertainment, was on the verge of declaring bankruptcy. As a company in its infancy, this turn of events came as a shock to many, but was the outcome of a string of ill ill-advised business decisions. The collapse of Brash came about from an assortment of underlying issues that eventually manifested themselves into a perfect storm, chief among which was their lack of experience. Their CEO, Mitch Davis, had no prior experience in video game publishing, and nobody else on their board of directors had even worked in the industry. Where things really took a turn for the worse was after the company signed a deeply misjudged deal with Fox to produce tie-ins based around some of their upcoming animated features. Brash had initially approached them in the hopes of creating a Night at the Museum video game, and were told that in order to gain access to that property, they would need to sign a contract obligating them to do several other games first. These titles would use notably less valuable IPs like the movies Jumper and Space Chimps. On top of that, since the films they were linked with were due to come out within the following 12 months, it gave their development teams less than a single year to fully develop these games. The end result was a set of hastily thrown together tie-ins that received a critical mauling and sold short of expectations. Taking on projects with rushed development cycles like these cheapened the Brash brand and quickly tarnished their reputation in the industry. In their final months, they did look to be on the verge of turning a corner, as they were finally gaining access to more valuable intellectual property like DC superheroes and the Saw movies. They were also starting to work with more established and respected developers, allowing them much larger budgets and longer development cycles to ensure quality. It was, however, too little too late. Over the course of 2008, various members of their board left, and the company sank further and further into debt. By November, Brash could no longer afford to pay its developers and shut down. At Factor 5, they now faced a crisis. With the loss of their publisher, their Superman title was now up against the possibility of cancellation. By this point, it was being referred to by a tentative title of Superman: Man of Steel. Although some minor progress had been made towards building the open-world metropolis, the game was far from complete. The Nintendo Wii version, one former designer told me, was hardly able to get off the ground. Aside from some documents identifying potential uses of the system's controls, very little was ever done. Despite how strongly opposed they were to making an inferior game on the Wii, some ex-members of Factor 5 are quick to admit that it likely would have been a somewhat scaled-back form of its high-definition cousins. Their focus, as ever, was on the PS3 release. When the first signs of trouble loomed, Factor 5's management had the opportunity to shelve Superman and lay off a handful of staff members to keep the studio open and working on other projects. As opposed to this, they would gamble with the company's future by using their own limited monetary resources to pay for the next month of development themselves. The hope was that another publisher would come on board and agree to fund the rest of it. However, the game still had a long way to go before it would be finished, meaning that a substantial financial investment was required. In fall 2008, during the height of the global financial crisis, that was a hard sell to say the least. At first, the developers at Factor 5 were kept in the dark about Brash's impending doom. Staff alleged that when their wages for November weren't transferred, their president Julian Egrecht misled them, claiming it was down to a glitch in the payroll system. He allegedly promised that they would receive what they were owed by the following payday. A couple of weeks later, the truth was out, and Egrecht confessed that Brash's closure meant that nobody would be paid unless a new publishing partner was found. The development team, despite their uncertainty about the studio's security, continued on into November. On December 1st, they weren't reimbursed for November. Instead, the situation worsened. Due to Factor 5's failure to pay premiums, each employee lost their health benefits. By mid-December, Factor 5 had burned through their remaining reserve of cash. Their plan to attract a new publisher was clearly not working, and with that, the studio's fate was sealed. Without providing adequate notice to employees, Factor 5 closed only days before Christmas, laying everyone off. Their last 2 months of work went unpaid, resulting in a series of lawsuits that dragged out for years later. The main case against the founders of the company for unsettled wages wasn't fully resolved until December 2015. When the development house fell, so did Superman: Man of Steel with it. In the end, outside of the basic flying and combat mechanics, it was largely a collection of ideas that had yet to fully transcend into a tangible experience. Still, it represents a vision heavy on fanservice service made by a team hell-bent on getting Superman right. Their doomed deal with Brash Entertainment was a multi-game contract expected to be a fresh start for Superman in the medium of video games after years of poorly received releases. Its cancellation meant not only the loss of one title, but a whole potential series that quietly disappeared. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to check out more unreleased games, there are many other videos just like this one over on my channel. Like the same company's attempt at making a Pilot Wings for Nintendo set during the Cold War. Or you can stick around here and see another Unseen64 video looking into the cancelled Batman The Dark Knight video game. You can visit Unseen64 at unseen64.net. The site is an archive for cancelled, unreleased and beta games. I've been Liam, I hope this video has been of interest, and have fun.